something beside me, a light to the kerosene, and the places aren't real anymore, and the faces don't say anything, in the silent light of the mind-blown sphere. It's a game, Devil's Chess Club. Devil's Chess Club.
Welcome to Devil's Chess Club. I'm Aaron Good. This episode of Devil's Chess Club is available to everyone, courtesy of Four Died Trying, the new documentary film series which explores the extraordinary lives and cataclysmic assassinations of JFK, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, and RFK. A Patreon page for Four Died Trying has launched. It offers patrons the earliest access to new films and a number of other perks, now including access to the newest film, Chapter 1, The World as It Was. Soon you'll be able to purchase Chapter 1 on Apple TV and other streaming services. Please support us by subscribing to the American Exception podcast on Patreon. You will get access to many episodes of the American Exception podcast, including the Peter Dale Scott Oral History series, with new episodes this month. Peter is a peerless poet, scholar, and chronicler of the deep state. We've been discussing his lesser-known but very important poem and the article about the forgotten Russian 9/11, as well as its connections to the American 9/11 and to so much more. This is fascinating material coming from a true iconoclast. I urge everyone to listen to these by subscribing to the American Exception podcast on Patreon. Coming up in just a moment, Bryce Green and I are joined again by Sam Husseini, an independent journalist who's been piercing through the establishment's falsifications for 25 years. Even prior to COVID being declared a pandemic, Husseini questioned the CDC and then wrote a series of in-depth pieces scrutinizing the establishment's claims that the pandemic could not have a lab origin. Going back to the 1990s, Sam has a long track record of exposing what I would candidly describe as the criminality of the U.S. empire. I encourage everyone to subscribe to Sam Husseini's Substack, which we will link to in the show notes. Sam Husseini, thanks for joining us again.
Good to be with you, Aaron. Good to be with you, Bryce.
So we are recording this right after the President's State of the Union address. Sam, what did you think of the President and his performance? What do you make of it?
I thought it was quintessential Biden. Biden, at his core, embodies a sense of privilege and fake righteousness that gives him a sort of strength that people don't immediately see. So I think people might have been surprised by the performance, but I kind of have always seen that in him. In terms of the general contour of it, I thought it was very shrewd. He emphasized economic policy and Russia and tried to bury, literally and figuratively, Gaza, which I thought was smart. He only mentioned Gaza at the tail end, and very skillfully, I thought, right after talking about gun control. So, like, he's all self-righteous at the end, saying, gun control, and saying to the gun manufacturer, stop it, stop it, stop it, so that he is pretending to be on the side of stopping violence, and so on. And then he immediately segues into Gaza after that, and portrays himself as, the Hamas, hiding in daycare centers is the problem, and that he's trying to do right by the Palestinians because he can read poll numbers.
Yeah, that's just it with the poll numbers. It doesn't seem that he has an easy path to getting back to the White House. I mean, it's a really strange situation. It's hard to imagine how anything's going to radically turn around his fortunes, but how much do you think that this Gaza thing is anything that he could even has the leeway to do anything about? I mean, apparently he's letting it really damage him. So what's driving this?
Yeah, it's I mean, I've often thought of presidents fundamentally as political suicide bombers for the empire. They'll sacrifice their political careers for the good of the empire, which created their political careers. I certainly saw that in terms of Bush and his ultimate, sort of being shuffled out unceremoniously, after invading Iraq.
Which Bush?
Oh,
You mean?
both actually, in
I
a
mean, the
way.
first guy, the first one.
I meant the second one.
I mean, the first one was the guy who said if the Israelis didn't enter into those peace talks, that he wouldn't offer those loan guarantees.
Right, and he
Uh,
ended up being a one-termer,
yeah,
and that example fits into a pattern of saying that fundamentally, the pro-Israeli faction can, in effect, blackball a president if he really starts to try to dictate terms to Israel. But so you know, in many respects, I almost don't see countries anymore. I mean, maybe this fits into your work in some ways, Aaron. I mean, there is a establishment that is fundamentally imperialist in the United States and Israel, and they work together with Britain, with Germany now, clearly, with much of the rest of NATO. And, nation states are, fundamentally tools for that establishment to use as they see fit. Um, and that's why you don't see. I remember, Bryce, you tweeted, some polling place in Virginia had an Israeli flag there, and you were like, "What the hell?" And I'm like, "No, this makes total sense." This
Yeah,
is
someone said that if it was a Soviet political cartoon, it'd be about American elections. It'd be labeled as anti-Semitic.
that's funny. That's very
Yeah,
funny. Yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
I could definitely see that being a satire of America. Like someone would, that is a joke someone would make, but
yeah, right,
reality hits harder.
right.
but it is. I
Um,
mean, it's the empire that we're talking about here was more or less assembled in the wake of World War II, and the U.S. took control over Western imperialism as a whole, and all of those colonial empires of the French and the British and everyone else. They get You have decolonization, and it's really neocolonialism, and the Cold War is kind of the ultimate pretext for every neocolonial policy that the U.S. empire has. And now we still do have, empire as a political formation that overrides national sovereignty, and that's really been the U.S.'s mo for many decades. But what we are, I mean, as far as the nation states being irrelevant or that being kind of a new thing, I mean, the empire has been what it has been for a while, and Europe really never had any sovereignty after World War II. I don't personally think Western Europe, um, when France attempted to go its own way at certain points, and there was conflict there. They tried to assassinate de Gaulle, and eventually they're more brought into the NATO fold. But what is notable is that I think the rest of the world really is against this empire that you're talking about. I mean, the UN votes have said that this block of nations, the White Power League or whatever we want to call it, it really is more unpopular than it ever has been. I mean, it seems to be, on the one hand, yeah, it's this empire nakedly overriding any sort of international law, but on the other hand, I think that the empire is worse off relative to any time in my lifetime.
yeah, in some ways, but it sort of needs conflict to keep going. And it's not clear to me who's going to stand up to it. I mean, you had South Africa go to the International Court of Justice, and you have these overwhelming votes in the General Assembly. But you also have, countries The president of Colombia made some remarks at a recent Latin America meeting where he basically said, they're going to go after each and every one of us. So I think from the point of view of other countries that might at some level want to stop this, it's like a solidarity question, right? It's like whoever speaks up against it will get targeted. But eventually, if the juggernaut is allowed to continue, they'll all get targeted eventually. But nobody wants to get targeted first, right?
It's like a version of the prisoner's dilemma. Like if all countries in the world act in concert against the
Right,
United States, there might be some hope of changing the behavior, but unless they're organized in some way, then they're all atomized. And when they're
right,
atomized, they can be targeted one by one.
right. Or and not subject I know a ton about, but labor organizing. Like if you kiss ass to the boss, then maybe he'll treat you okay. But what you really need to do is unionize with your fellow workers in order to, affect actual change. So I think that tension is there. So like the General Assembly has not, you know, gone back to doing uniting for peace and doing a whole series of things that they could do, suspending Israel, admitting Palestine, starting a tribunal to go after individual Israelis, pushing for sanctions and so on. The General
So,
Assembly has not yet done that.
could you talk a little bit more about what those options are for the General Assembly and how they would work? Like, would it really just take one country to go before the General Assembly and put forth a motion that would expel Israel or that would implement some sort of sanction? Or is it more complicated than that? Does there need to be a coalition before that can happen?
I'm not actually sure about if one country could do it. As with South Africa going to the ICJ, it was just you just needed one country to do it. I think you do need to have a bunch of countries line this up, and the so-called Arab group at the UN has made noise about this for some time, but they haven't done anything. Um, but you would think that you would have a coalition right now of a lot of countries who would, invoking uniting for peace. Uniting for peace is a mechanism whereby if the Security Council is unable to fulfill its function, basically, that the General Assembly can attempt to effectively wrestle control. And that's kind of the situation that we're in. We're in a basically global constitutional crisis in a way. I mean, we've been that way for decades, but it's sort of a crisis point here. Um, and so they could, using Uniting for Peace, do a whole series of things. They can definitely do two very simple things: suspend Israel from participation in the General Assembly, and admit Palestine, such as it is, as a member. But they could also go beyond that in terms of um, advocating that countries cut off diplomatic relations with Israel. They did similar processes in regards to apartheid South Africa, um, and economic sanctions, and past tribunals have been set up by the Security Council on Rwanda and Yugoslavia. But several legal analysts have argued that the General Assembly could do that as well. They could set up a tribunal to go after individual Israelis. Obviously, the International Criminal Court, which is completely corrupt with this British barrister Khan, refuses to do so. He just goes after Africans and Russians. He never goes after NATO or Israel or the U.S. Obviously.
Yeah, that seems to be the way of it. I mean, international law has been overridden by the sort of the global hegemon, which has been the United States for a long time, and it's a joke. I mean, it is a joke, and there's nothing that we can do about it yet. I hope I have a hope, which I'm sure you probably do as well, Sam, that at some level these other powers, the other world's great powers, Russia, China, they may be um, biding their time and assessing when would be the right time to kind of take some more decisive action. I mean, I think that this, for the Palestinians, it is it really is life or death, like they're on a knife's edge. But for other countries in the world, there's also this question. I mean, I think the whole global South, formerly colonized world. I think that they all are hoping to eventually have this different world order, this different regime that will be more about international law. But this, everyone understands that it's perilous to even to think about how this is going to be established more, to how to have a clean break with this era of gangsterism that the U.S. and Israel represent, which it's been our whole lives, so we don't even know that that's what it is, but it really has been. It's been a rule where these, white countries can do whatever they want around the world, and the rest of the world just has to take it, and they'll tell you how it's going to be, and they'll even set up a criminal court to try other criminals, but never themselves. I mean, it's a horrific thing, and it's also fraught with peril for anyone who would try to mess with it, because they have the ability to blow up the whole world, on purpose. And the reason they have that is really to hold on to their global dominance. So I'm hoping that there's some sort of plan being made by these countries, and that the South Africa prosecution was perhaps the first part of it, and that there's more coming, because I think that there are other options with even with the criminal court or the UN court, even as weak as it is, there's still other options there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's a very messy chicken and egg problem. And I think that civil society and independent journalists play a key role. I mean, South Africa didn't invoke the Genocide Convention right out of the gate. I think they had to be pushed, by activists, by local constituencies. All these countries were calling it genocide for months before anyone would actually invoke the Genocide Convention. So, you have Lula now calling it genocide. Again, he did that a couple months ago, and then he did it with great fanfare recently. Well, we got to push him to do the right thing. I don't think that we should see these, other countries as necessarily moral agents. They have their self-interest, and I think it's up to it, the global public and, whatever independent groups of journalists are out there in order to expose this and to push them to use all of their faculties, for their stated goals. Um, I don't view international law as a magic wand that's going to solve this. It's like one of 23 levers. And yeah, I mean, you have, people doing boycott, divestment, sanctions. You have just regular street protests. You have, independent media exposing things. So it's a whole series of things.
Yeah, that idea of like using multiple levers is important, because again, you're right. South Africa didn't invoke the Genocide Convention instantly. Some of their spokespeople have talked a big game about how much this means to them as a country, and how much how much justice means to them. But they only did it after months and months of killing. And so, like you said, this only happened because people mobilized, because people like you were pumping out articles talking about invoke the Genocide Convention, and people presumably, in high places read that and responded to it, or at least got creative and started pitching it to their bosses, or what have you. But it seems like there's no there's no moral agent. There's no savior here. It's all people power, and it's always going to be people power, and that can manifest in different ways.
Right. And I mean, I wrote one of the hardest pieces that I ever wrote as a result of that, and I might have to do it again. They call it genocide, but don't invoke the Genocide Convention. And I listed all of the countries and all the leaders that were saying it's genocide, and genocide. I'm like, you guys can actually invoke. I mean, I almost respect the United States in some way, right? I mean, they wouldn't say Rwanda was genocide, because then they knew that they had to act, right? But here you have all these other countries that were acting, but weren't, that were saying it, but weren't acting. So, it's good that South Africa did that. They've gone again to the court. Hopefully the court will issue, more direct, orders. But I think that it's got to be used by other things. I mean, the ICJ order should be used massively, and I think it's starting to be used substantially by boycott, divestment, sanctions, for example. Um, but all of this is kind of late given the perilous situations of the Palestinians in Gaza.
Right, and culturally, I mean, do you think that the tide? How much do you think the tide is turning in the U.S.? I mean, you wrote a piece recently about the self-immolation of Aaron Bushnell. Do you think that that even among the U.S., it's getting to be something that's going to be politically impactful? I mean, I think that all of the candidates, at least Biden and Kennedy, are going to have a hard time appearing anywhere without being shouted at by people, demanding that they respond to genocide in Gaza. So, I mean, and I think Aaron Bushnell kind of, really personified the moral outrage of people watching this.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Biden's carefully chosen words at the State of the Union were very indicative that he realizes where the public is on this now. Um, uh, and I think it just needs to be pushed more and more. I mean, I remember in the 1980s, after Israel's invasion of Lebanon, you had people being disgusted by it, including mainstream figures, and ultimately Ronald Reagan saying, you got to cut it out. Um, so you have this, periodic dynamic of Israel, you know, sort of showing its true face, and then it kind of, gets a labor government and rebrands itself and does this two-step. Um, so I think, now it's imperative that that this really show the core issue of Israel as a genocidal settler colonial state, and that really be endemic rather than a transitory thing as it has been in the past.
Right. I think that for the younger people, they really are. They're shocked by the things that they've seen. I mean, this is the scale of this is much bigger than the other atrocities that they commit, on regularly, and the way that it can be seen on, graphically on social media and such. I don't think that the Zionist crowd was prepared exactly for this backlash, and I don't. It doesn't seem that there's a going back after this, and that they just keep going forward with the slaughter, and so it actually
Right.
brings us to something else that you'd written about, and that is Ralph Nader saying that he estimated 200,000 Palestinians are dead in Gaza. Now, this would be probably people that are also dying from, I mean, there's malnutrition deaths now. There's a
Right.
tremendous lack of access to clean water and everything else. But what do you? I'll even put an excerpt here of this. From accounts of people on the ground, videos, and photographs of deadly episode after episode, plus the resultant mortalities from blocking or smashing the crucial necessities of life, a more likely estimate, in my appraisal, is that at least 200,000 Palestinians must have perished by now, and the toll is accelerating by the hour. So I don't necessarily put much stock in the exact number, but Sam, do you think that it's quite likely that the real number of deaths is much higher than what we've been told?
I think it's possible. I mean, you have the health ministry basically said that they couldn't keep counting back in November. And as you say, now you have starvation and diseases. I mean, Anne Frank didn't die, in a gas chamber or in a bullet to the head. She died of typhoid. You're going to have people dying of a whole series of things that Israel has created the conditions of, not necessarily a bullet to the head, although that's obviously going on as well. Um, and so, yeah, I mean, Nader lays out, a good deal of evidence, and you've had some public health people roll out numbers that are more perhaps systematic than what Nader did, but and aren't quite as high, but are substantially higher than the 30,000 figure that's now generally finally accepted. Um, I'd like to go back for a minute to you're talking about Kennedy and Biden and so on. I mean, I view it, in trying to make this endemic, it's going to be difficult because of the election, right? Because Biden did a whole pseudo populist rant on the State of the Union, so he's going to try to um, uh, segment Palestine as you know the troublemakers, whereas he's trying to pursue this agenda for the good of the American people, um, and reproductive rights. That's basically all he's got, or all he's pretending to have. Um, so, I mean, I've long advocated what I've called the vote pact strategy. I've written about it. I'm going to keep writing about it because I think it's the solution of an anti-establishment center from the left and right coming together. Um, what we have now is the exact opposite, with Cornel West and Jill Stein and Robert Kennedy Jr. all splintering anti-establishment forces in effect. I mean, sometimes it's over ideology, but sometimes it's not. I mean, I'm not sure what issues Jill Stein and Cornel West differ on. So, what I feel is needed is like, a united anti-establishment candidate to bring different levels of dissent together rather than what we're seeing. So it's quite possible that the election will be used to dissipate all of the energy around Palestine over the next 8 months or whatever, um, and will be portrayed as quote unquote troublemakers. I assume that that's the establishment's agenda in this regard.
Right. Yeah, the Cornel West candidacy is quite baffling. As I understand it, he doesn't want to be on ballots in swing states. Have other people heard that as well?
Yeah, I mean, again,
All of these people running is kind of strange to me. I mean, you have Jill Stein, you have Cornel West, and then you have the PSL women. I forget their names, but they're also running in an anti-establishment ticket. It doesn't seem like there's any organized resistance, at least on a federal presidential level. Which again, I keep saying this on the show is like why I don't pay as much attention to it.
yeah,
Because you're right, it will suck up a lot of energy. It will suck up a lot of discursive time and effort that we could better be spending elsewhere. I mean,
I agree.
you mentioned that this might be a time where people realize that Israel went too far, that this is the true face of Israel. But in 2018-19, when I was first learning about this issue, one of the things that I was reading about was people saying the same thing after 2008, after Cass led. There was
Right.
a whole like massive flood of articles in mainstream publications talking about Americans' relationship with Israel will never be the same after this. And then you saw the same thing in the wake of 2014,
That's correct.
where after Protective Edge, Israel could never recover from this. They'll have to make a new change, and yet here we are, where they're doing something worse than they've ever done in history, and maybe this is the real time that things are going to change. At least on the ground, I'm seeing it. There are many young people that I'm organizing with, like undergraduates, who have said that they came in to school wanting to study something, wanting to study business or architecture or what have you, and they're radicalized now. They're like, well, my life is going to be devoted to organizing, to try and make the world better, to try and oppose empire.
Right.
And I don't know if there was, I said that every generation of young people has their moments. Some people, it was like Johnson and Nixon with Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia. For some people, it was Bush in Iraq. But our generation now has Gaza, and Gaza is worse than anything. It's worse than Iraq. I mean, in terms of the sheer volume of deaths per day and the sheer number of bombs being dropped every day. I mean, it's worse than 2003. And so I do think that this is a moment where people are going to have a different view of Israel. It's going to be a major break in the system. And I think that if we funnel too much energy into the presidential politics to channel on this issue, again, it might dissipate afterwards when. I'm saying when Cornel West, Jill Stein, or whoever else loses the race, people can see that as a defeat. But I mean, the most important things you can do happen in between those elections, and I think people are mobilized to actually start doing it.
Yeah, but they have to keep doing it during an election, and that'll be a challenge, but one that people need to live up to.
I tend to think that the international situation is going to force the U.S. to alter course before anything that we can do domestically. And if time will obviously tell whether I'm correct about that, but it's just so hopeless, the domestic political situation. Even people like West, people had hope in West, and then I think he actually didn't want to do what he said he wanted to do. I don't see why he leaves the Greens, except the fact that he leaves the Greens, and we now see that he's not, if this is correct, that he's not on the ballot in swing states. I mean, that just points to like he actually didn't want to do it. He didn't want to. He didn't want to be Ralph Nader. You know, his vanity could not suffer having liberals hate him. And so there really wasn't anyone who was going to fully take on the establishment, you know, because Cornel West didn't want to take on the liberal establishment ultimately, just like RFK won't take on, you know, the lobby. And, you know, I think Jill Stein's campaign is mostly, her positions are mostly pretty solid, and she's not afraid of so she's kind of the only sort of serious one, I think.
Yeah,
Yeah, this comment about sorry Sam, but this comment about not wanting to be Ralph Nader is one I've heard before. Chris Hedges was actually speaking with Bernie Sanders a few years ago at an event, and Bernie told Hedges that the reason that he's behaving the way he is because he doesn't want to be a Ralph Nader. He doesn't want to be hated by liberals. He doesn't want to be blamed for whatever nonsense Republicans do. And that appears to be an effective threat for someone like Bernie Sanders, who, he's definitely not a firebrand radical, but at least his heart is in a better place than most politicians. But the fear of being ostracized and being marginalized seems to keep people in check, and it appears that Cornel West is not immune to that.
I hate to be a broken record, but back in 2000, I pleaded with Ralph Nader to adopt the vote pact strategy. And Ralph Nader was in a unique position to do it because he kind of has appeal to conservatives, small town conservatives, in a way that, say, Jill Stein or Cornel West probably don't. And he could have, brought traditional conservatives and populist conservatives and libertarians and so on together with progressives and sort of been the front person for that. He wouldn't do it. And what happened in 2000 was predictable, and I defend what he did. I voted for him. But, again, I come back to, if you're not going to do vote pact, and no, the only person who's done vote pact, was a PAC associated with Gary Johnson in 2016. And nobody remembers, but Gary Johnson ran the most successful third party campaign, even though he was a lousy candidate.
I was a Bernie Sanders Johnson voter.
Okay. Yeah, so, I mean, I can see the logic of that. Since Ross Perot, Johnson got more votes than Nader did in 2000. So that if you're going to come in from the margins, you're going to be demonized by the people who agree with you most, right? Now, maybe it'll be different because there's a genocide, and if Jill Stein is hyper articulate on Gaza and hyper articulate on economic stuff, she'll catch fire, and it'll be a once in a million year event, and she'll actually win. Kind of doubt it, but it's possible. But what I've been advocating for over 25 years now is what no progressive or the only candidate who's done it is sort of Johnson, or it was a PAC associated with Johnson. They took my idea, and I was kind of insulted, but I was also kind of glad that it took off. and he got whatever it was, 4%. But even because he's a lousy candidate, if you had somebody who's a good candidate who could appeal to the left and right, employing a strategy, I think that that's the highest likelihood of a independent or third party candidate actually winning. But I don't see that anybody in the current field is capable or even has the desire to do that. I mean, Kennedy might in a perverse way, but I think that would be tragic as well from my point of view.
Yeah, I mean, I can't figure out what ultimately his
Yeah.
his deal is there. So
Yeah.
hard to say if he would change if he would have to be if he would be different in office or different in a bad way. It was about Israel. I don't see how you can do much worse because I already see the U.S. is going way beyond what is like the rational national interest of the U.S. even from an imperial perspective in the way that it's backing Israel. So this is something that we're going to have to unfortunately watch as it plays out because this is a very top-down system that we're living in, and we see what the people at the top have decided for us. Sam, I want to talk about one last article that you had written, not too long ago, and this is on Malcolm X. Um, the prophecies of Malcolm X, Zionism, a new form of colonialism, and I'm a fan of Malcolm X, and I'm working on the Four Died Trying series, doing helping to promote it essentially. And Malcolm X is, of course, one of the four who died trying in the 1960s, assassinated by the state. There's a quote here. This is from your article. It's at your Substack, so we'll link to that. Little known, Malcolm X wrote in 1964, the Israeli Zionists are convinced they have successfully camouflaged their new kind of colonialism. He talks about neo-imperialism and it's dollarism. So he's really talking about neo-colonialism like his friend Kwame Nkrumah, who was really working on a book by that title at the same time. And Malcolm X goes on to say, the Zionists have mastered the science of dollarism, the ability to come posing as a friend and a benefactor, bearing gifts in all their forms of economic aid and offers of technical assistance. Their power in the newly independent African nations has fast become even more unshakable than that of 18th century European colonialists. This new type of Zionist colonialism differs only in form and method, but never in motive or objective. Now, that's the kind of thing that could be, people could say that this is anti-Semitism or something like that today. But I mean, when you look at Israel and how it's functioned, it is involved in a lot of neo-colonial chicanery around the world. In that way, it kind of is the little thug buddy of the United States. How do you what do you think about Malcolm X as we reflect on this moment? I mean, we need more of that radicalism from people today and that dynamism, and it just seems to be kind of lacking for one reason or another.
Yeah, absolutely. I started writing the piece on him like the night before. It was his birth. It was. I'm sorry, I'm blanking. No, it was
Maybe the anniversary of the
assassination.
assassination, or
Assassination. Although I think we're in the 99th year of his birthday. Um, so, um, I mean, his just laying stuff out without any sense of triangulation, as you see from other, great, reformers or such. Just his radicalism. So I came across that article in the course of writing that piece, and I felt ashamed that, my gosh, I don't think I'd ever seen this article before. Um, and you know, I think you're absolutely right, Aaron, in terms of having that kind of clear voice um, is so rare right now. And I think that I mean, that's part of the way that the system operates. That somebody who, I don't know, maybe this is a terrible lesson to draw, that somebody who speaks that clearly, ends up getting killed. Um, and we need to find a way around that. And I think that's why we're sort of developing networks of people and so on, in order to sort of encircle the problem, so that when somebody does come forward with that kind of clear voice, it's not just simply one person who's easy to take out. Um, so that it points to a lot of critical problems.
right? It's he was kind of the paragon, really, of a person who was intellectually fearless and was not afraid to discard different notions and revise what he was trying to think, so that his ideology was a work in progress,
Very
which
much.
is an approach I think that the left it's missing today. The left thinks like I am my ideology is 100% correct, and if I just adhere to it, eventually I will be like a visible saint, like a Puritan in Boston in 1700, and
Right.
the consciousness will be uplifted, and then the singularity of whatever of Marxian utopia will be achieved or something. I mean, Malcolm X was more trying to figure out what he had thought that was wrong before and fix it and reassess it, and he became more accepting of like the general humanity of all people, and really had some profound insights in the last years of his life. And then, of course, they kill him for it. I mean, it's his autobiography. Take his bravado aside, it's like an amazing. It's one of the most amazing historical documents in the U.S. I think.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, I mean, listen to that. I mean, it's been a source of frustration for me in terms of a lot of people are doing good work on Gaza, and we need to do more and more of that. But there's this total disconnect between, people who sort of get Gaza and people who, I was working with, 3 years ago on the pandemic. And, pandemic narrative, I focused on COVID origins, for example, and they're totally different spheres of people. And, you know, um, I find it frustrating that each of those groups seem very reluctant to rethink what they may be right and wrong about. Um, and it's also noteworthy to me that their enemies are the same, right? That like big tech censored stuff around the pandemic 3 years ago, and now it's clearly targeting Palestine stuff. I mean, nothing I post on Palestine gets more than 3 likes on Facebook. That's a bit of an exaggeration. When I do a picture, sometimes it gets going, but in any content, any actual analysis is clearly massively shadow banned. And I'm sure that there's some shadow banning on X or Twitter, whatever it's called. Um,
I mean,
so
it's to the point that you could say Facebook is essentially like a censorship operation.
yeah, totally. I mean, people have called,
Yeah,
Google isn't a search engine; it's a hiding engine. That kind of thing.
exactly. Especially over the last decade or so, both Facebook and Google, they've been, under the guise of this fear of misinformation and foreign influence campaigns, they've essentially just given the range of information control to the powers that already existed, and which undercuts the idea of the internet as a not completely, but undercuts the internet as a liberatory tool, at least with these
Right,
platforms.
right,
Well,
right.
to
And
me, it
this,
shows
And
the bankruptcy of the whole thing, the whole enterprise. If our most powerful economic enterprises are dedicated to making sure people cannot know the truth, that just shows that the Enlightenment has failed in the West, and that we are a moribund zombie empire.
yeah, I mean, to me, it's a lot like in studying COVID origins and dealing with big tech. Everything has a political economy, so it's not like science is bad because they're creating more deadly pathogens. It's the political economy and the
Capitalism.
capitalism with under the rubric of empire. I mean, I don't know that capitalism per se would want to be making more deadly pathogens, but the U.S. government does want to make more deadly pathogens. I could, maybe envision an ideal capitalism that would want of, free form of ideas and so on. But our form of corporate capitalism wants to restrict ideas and information, and so on. And that's what we're seeing. So, you know, big tech and all the promises of technology are bunk. Um, because of the political economy of what these big tech corporations are. Absolutely.
And that is an issue with the medical freedom people, but I find them to be a little, at least when I was with the Kennedy Beacon, that the
Hmm.
people that were there motivated by medical freedom were also fairly receptive to ideas of imperialism that they never really thought of before. I mean, most
That's
of them,
okay.
I mean, it's not that they couldn't figure out that, yeah, the Iraq war was a bad thing, but it's like, I do think that that there are to hear more critiques about these things, and that, but ultimately this sort of love of the ideological affinity for capitalism and their own property without recognizing the problems of inherent in capitalism and capitalist political economy. And capitalism is, the British version of it is really what fueled settler colonialism. I mean, it's a very straightforward thing. You kick people off the land for like textile industries and to raise sheep, and then they go and colonize Ireland, they colonize the U.S., and they set up business enterprises there. That's why you get the potato famine. That's why they got to kill the Indians, and then they're worried about how this is going to affect them, the empire, and so they start using slaves basically instead of white people because it was easier to handle. I mean, but this commercial economy of international trade and capitalism is just driving the whole thing and the whole evolution of the state and the logic of these entities that are, the big pharma, the national security state empire, uber alles, full spectrum dominance. It's all driven by the interests of the oligarchs at the top of this system who make money in their sleep basically because they own everything. And it's the heart of it, and it's a difficult thing to get people to grasp this. And I think the left often alienates people about things that are sort of straightforward. It's like, you don't have to say, well, therefore the only alternative is like 1958 China. It's like it's just recognizing what is driving this system, and people can't do it fundamentally. Ideologically, they just want to confirm their priors, and they put the world into that sphere. We need more people who have the approach of Malcolm X to be like, how can I devote myself to understanding what is going on? And we don't have as much of that as we should.
Yeah, I mean, I don't understand why like a cooperative hasn't sprung up as a big tech platform, right? That I could trust, and that would create a substantial audience.
Well, Mastodon has tried, and it's sort of federated software that individuals can use and run their own servers. But it has its own problems in terms of if you want to be on the popular servers and you want to be posted there, then you have to appeal to the moderators of that server.
Right.
And so there's problems there, and I'm sure creative people are thinking about how to get around that. But I mean, that is a start. I do think that if there's ever going to be a future online, like a digital future for us, it'll involve things like Mastodon. It'll involve things like free and open source software being massively adopted. Uh, Kind of semi hopeful about that, but for people to use it, they'd have to understand what's wrong with the current tech systems. And again, I always say that the Palestine issue right now is not only an organizing opportunity, but an education opportunity. It's a time to connect those issues, like you said, with the people
Hmm.
who are, talking about COVID origins, but don't have a critique of empire, to the people who have a critique of empire, but aren't willing to, integrate big pharma's role in perpetuating empire. Again, it's all an educational opportunity for uh, different sects of the anti-establishment tendencies to share and learn from each other.
Great.
Sam, is there any thing you'd like to promote here? We'll put links to your Substack, but anything else that you'd like to direct our viewers to?
No, that's pretty much where I'm, trying to crank stuff out these days. I'm trying to spend less and less time on Twitter, and more and more time just, writing articles on Substack. I launched my Vote Pact site, and Vote Pact. I mean, we're talking about this dialogue between different things. Regardless of the political impact, it's a mechanism where of what we're talking about, of getting people to break out of their sects and to be talking and cooperating in some ways with people who aren't in their particular, um, uh, you know, uh, thin sliver of political thought.
Very good. Sam Husseini, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thanks to Dana Chavarria for producing this episode, and thank you for tuning in. You can buy or rent the Four Died Trying prologue now on Amazon and other streaming platforms, and Chapter 1 is also available now. Visit fourdiedtrying.com for details. Please do subscribe to the American Exception podcast on Patreon for first access to all Devil's Chess Club episodes and for all new and past episodes of the American Exception podcast, including the Peter Dale Scott Oral History series. It is wild to think about Malcolm X in 2024. Among so many other things, his comments on the JFK assassination were prophetic. Dallas really did represent America's imperial chickens coming home to roost. Those same chickens came for Malcolm next. But the neocolonialism that Malcolm warned about has returned, if it ever left, which it didn't. Nemesis has arrived for the white Western Empire. Finally, the oligarchs of the West have no one to blame but themselves. They had so much power after World War II that they could have brought peace and prosperity to the world. Instead, they chose to rebrand colonialism in order to keep dominating humanity. Instead of peace and justice, they went for empire. They thought they could win forever on the devil's chessboard.